Now we stick with insights from Gauteng's Investment Conference. Neale emphasized the significance of sectors critical to ensuring development on a provincial, national and continental level. Among these is advanced manufacturing, transport and logistics, and green energy and renewable energy. President for Ford Africa, Neale Hill, was among the business leaders in attendance, and he joined me to unpack the importance of the province's economic growth for businesses that operate in it and the factors that hinder that. Here's that conversation.
Gauteng is the home of our Silverton vehicle assembly operations, is very much our home. And, although we started in Port Elizabeth, bulk of our activity happens here in Gauteng, where we've got our manufacturing facility, and then also right adjacent to it is the Tshwane Special Economic Automotive Zone that we've established in conjunction with the three sectors of government. So this is very, very important to us.
And there have been calls from some players, a think tank, I think it was yesterday, calling for the private sector to take control over these SE zones, these special economic zones. Talk to me about your perspective on that. And just when it comes to, the overall partnership between the private sector and the public sector.
I think it's important to reflect in terms of what makes these special economic zones work. Our job is to find investors, to find suppliers, to find companies that go in and do business and actually establish points of operation, and then for us to take their products, the goods that they produce, and utilize them in our productive processes. I think it's important that the administration and the running of those is left in the right hands. So that's where I think the balance between a private and a public partnership is so important. The private sector, we're good at putting economic activities in place, building parts, buying parts, doing that kind of stuff. The administration and the running of those, I think it's very important that it's left in the right hands. So that would be my perspective, is that we've got to find that balanced approach where we allow the people who are experts in their fields to do what they need to do.
So Neale, you speak about, leaving things in the right hands, making sure the private sector plays its part, but the public sector also plays its part. And this brings me to my next question. When we talk about growth in South Africa, a key phrase sticks out, which is structural reforms. So yes, we've gotten, risks with load shedding, that seems to be faring well, that seems to have subsided. But when we look at our ports and rails, that still seems to be an issue. And I know Ford being a really big exporter, that also, hurting your expense line.
It's very much a pain point for us. So we've been working very closely with Transnet in terms of the whole logistics value chain. And, when you think about the value chain starts with us bringing in we've got imported components that we bring in from overseas. We've got to get them through the ports. We've got to get them onto up to our facilities in Pretoria to be able to go into the production line. And then 65% of our production is exported. So we're heavily reliant on an efficient and smoothly operating Transnet logistics, value chain, if I can put it that way. So, we've seen improvements in the ports, and we know that there's been a lot of investment that's been taking place, particularly in Durban, related to the container terminal, so Pier 1, Pier 2, lots of investment in equipment for container handling. And there's been some investment also going into the container terminal, or the car terminal, I should say, in Durban, where there's been a lot of expansion. The pieces after the port are where we really the country needs to focus on.
Yeah.
Because there's the back of port operations. So Durban, as a port, is really congested because it's in the middle of a city. Then on top of that, you've got a train line that runs, or a rail line that runs between Durban and Johannesburg, that is prone to breakdowns and prone to challenges. And that's where the real challenge is. That's got to be smoothly operating. We work very closely with Transnet in terms of what our offtake is, in terms of the number of trains we require a week. We're getting less than half of that a week. So what that ends up meaning is that we've ultimately then got to go and make alternative plans. And that's why you see so many car carriers with Ford Rangers on the N3 between Durban and Johannesburg. It's because we have to resort to using trucks as opposed to using trains. It's less efficient, and South Africa is one of the only countries in the world where road freight is equal to if not cheaper, than rail freight. So there's massive untapped opportunity because we're not the only ones in Gauteng that produce vehicles for export. We have BMW across across Pretoria or Tshwane with their X3s that they export. So, and then you've got all of the importers that are bringing cars in. So there's a massive value chain in terms of movements of vehicles and components that can definitely support the business case for Transnet. We've got to get the rail up and working. We've got to make it reliable. We've got to make sure the signaling equipment works, and also the equipment that we're using to move vehicles and goods is reliable.
Now, with those dynamics you've mentioned, the dynamics at play, what does this do for, I guess, SA's competitiveness as an auto manufacturing hub? I mean, if it's difficult to get things around, I can imagine what it does for, a private sector player who's invested in the country.
That is such a good question, because Ford, like all of the other 6 OEMs in South Africa, we all compete for the right to produce vehicles in South Africa. So when we've got uncompetitive logistics costs, they go into the cost of producing vehicles and moving them from South Africa. And what that means is that from a South Africa Incorporated or South Africa Inc. perspective, we are not as competitive as some of our rivals are. And that can jeopardize future investment decisions because those costs have to be paid for. So it's a question in terms of how do we manage all of these logistics costs, and we're talking about one dimension of it at the moment, which is rail logistics or transport logistics. Then put onto that electricity tariffs, put onto that water tariffs, rates and taxes assessments. We've seen City of Tshwane increasing the valuation of our property, which increases our rates and taxes. So these are all input costs that ultimately either have to be absorbed by us as an operator, or they go onto the cost of the vehicle that we're exporting, which then potentially makes South Africa uncompetitive. So these are the challenges that we need to solve together. Understand that there's got to be a revenue income, there's got to be a revenue stream for government to provide the services, but we can't keep adding this onto the goods that we produce in South Africa because there's enough challenges in the world right now in terms of tariffs that we're seeing the US raising. That's all going to compound the competitiveness of South Africa going forward.
And I know that Ford doesn't necessarily export vehicles to the US, but you touched on something really important there, the tariff picture, the geopolitical picture that we are seeing play out. How concerned are you as an operator within South Africa, considering that Ford is also a US company? What do the dynamics playing out between SA and the US do to the company, if they do have an impact at all?
So the way Ford Motor Company looks at it is that we're an apolitical company. So we look at it in terms of we do business in countries around the world, and what we do is we work with the government that's in power, and we try to come up with workable business solutions. In the US right now, Ford is actually in a pretty good position. 80% of the vehicles that we sell in the US are actually produced in the US. There's a lot of components that are imported in the US. But if you look at the broader picture, the trade dynamics, as was mentioned by Minister Tau earlier in his address today, there are dynamics that have been restructured. The world, the geopolitical trade environment is going to be restructured. What it looks like, don't exactly know. The risk is that it drives up inflation because those costs have got to go somewhere. They can't be totally absorbed. There's going to be some that are going to be passed on. So I think that this is a period of everybody having to assess and understand what exactly the impact of these are, how long-term are they, what is the true extent of the nature of them, and then figure out what we're going to do from a trade perspective. But I think it's going to result in some shifts in trade balances or trade directions between countries that we've seen established for a long time. And
so that a look at the production picture, that a look at the export picture, but we also have, the sales picture. And we talk about, these big ideas, the impact of it on inflation, and that obviously then going to trickle down to the consumer. What is Ford doing to give it a competitive edge? I mean, we also have the Chinese vehicle makers really becoming dominant in the South African market.
Well, first of all, I'm going to challenge the notion of dominance. So we've seen a whole host of Chinese brands arriving in South Africa.
Yes.
What is very interesting is if you look at the percentage of the South African vehicle sales that they account for, At the moment, Chinese sourced vehicles account for about 10 to 12% of total vehicle sales in South Africa. There's actually a larger percentage of vehicles that are sold in South Africa that are actually imported from India. So that's actually trending in more at the 33, 34% level. Is the presence of the Chinese brands a challenging environment? Yes, it does, because they are very nimble, they move very quickly, they've got great technology, and the quality of the vehicles is good. What it means, though, is that we've got to be super competitive in terms of what our approach to the market is, and also we've got to find something that differentiates us from what they're offering. Ours is very much about how we look after our customers. So we talk about our Ford family promise. You buy a Ford vehicle, for example, we will look after you. We have a range of about 20 different elements that are competitive advantages to us. So it's about once you've bought the car, there's the after sales element of it. Things like, for example, you're too busy to have your car serviced. We'll come and fetch it from you, we'll service it, and we'll return it to you. Things like, for example, we'll come and service it at your place of work. These are the value adds that we're working on to differentiate the Ford brand from the others that really make owning a Ford a value proposition, and that we value you as a customer. So we have to reinvent ourselves, we have to adapt, we have to continually assess what our competitive edge is in the marketplace, because we live in a global village.
Yeah.
Would the competition go away if we asked them to? No, they're not. So what we've got to do is we've got to find different ways of competing with them. I think the one interesting challenge that we do need to assess is the balance between the investment that the 7 OEMs have made in South Africa to put our roots down here to make sizable investments, and now players that are coming in with no skin in the game and are now just competing in the South African market. That can't be an equal playing field with the investments that we've made, and I think that is part of the challenge we need to solve with government.
That was Neale Hill, president of Ford Africa.